Welcome back to History for Hours. Tonight, we drift down to the warm, quiet streets of New Orleans, where streetlights glow through humid air and power hides behind polite smiles. This is the world of Tommy Gagliano, a man who didn't chase attention, but commanded respect through patience, tradition, and quiet authority. In a city where music never sleeps and secrets travel faster than sound, Gagliano built influence not with chaos, but with calm control, where every move was measured and every silence meant something. Most couldn't survive a life like this, not because it was loud, but because it demanded discipline, loyalty, and the ability to rule without ever raising your voice. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if you truly enjoy these long, slow journeys through history's hidden corners. And if you're listening right now, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love knowing where these stories travel. Now dim the lights, let the city noise fade, and settle in as we ease into the quiet, commanding story of Tommy Gagliano. The story of power in New York is often told in shouts, in gunfire, in headlines, in the roar of flashy cars carrying brash men. But sometimes the most terrifying power whispers. It moves in the rustle of ledger pages, in the silent nod between businessmen, in the gentle, unshakable pressure that settles over an entire industry like a fog. This is not a story of the loudest man in the room. This is the story of the man who owned the room without ever raising his voice. This is the story of Tommy Gagliano, the Ghost Don. Our story begins not with a bang, but with a quiet observation. The Lower East Side of Manhattan, in the shadow of the new century, was a cacophony, a roaring, seething symphony of immigrant dreams and desperate survival. Tenements vomited people onto streets crowded with pushcarts. The air was thick with the smell of garlic, fish, and ambition. And in this chaos, a young boy from Sicily, Tommaso Gagliano, learned his first lesson. Noise attracted attention, and attention could be fatal. Tommy wasn't a brawler. He wasn't larger than life. He was slight, with watchful eyes that missed nothing. While other kids fought for dominance on the corner, Tommy was often a step back, near a doorway, calculating. He saw how the real power worked. It wasn't the boy with the hardest punch who controlled the game. It was the boy who controlled the bat and ball, or who had a cousin who could get the other's jobs unloading a ship. Power was about leverage. Control the resource and you control the people. His family, like thousands of others, was grindingly poor. His father worked in construction when there was work, which wasn't often. Tommy left school early, his education shifting from books to the street. He took any job he could find. A helper for a pushcart peddler, a runner for a tailor, a stock boy in a grocery. And in each place, his keen eyes dissected the ecosystem. He saw how the peddler paid a weekly coin to a local tough to protect his spot. He saw how the tailor got a better price on cloth from a certain supplier who was connected. He saw how the grocer's deliveries never seemed to be late or stolen. He was mapping an invisible city, one that existed within the official one. This shadow city had its own laws, its own economy, and its own rulers. And Tommy Gagliano, even as a teenager, decided he would rather be a ruler in the shadow city than a beggar in the bright one. His first step into that world was almost accidental. He was working for a small-time garment contractor, a nervous man named Mr. Feldstein, in a cramped, airless loft on Orchard Street. The place was a tinderbox of fabric scraps and dreams. One afternoon, two burly men with thick accents walked in. They didn't yell. They simply stood in the doorway, blocking the light, and asked to see the boss. Mr. Feldstein turned the color of old paper. They represented a protective association. For a monthly fee, they explained in calm, reasonable tones, Mr. Feldstein could be assured his valuable bolts of silk would not be ruined by a mysterious flood. His sewing machines would not suffer sudden, catastrophic breakdowns. The deliveries of his finished dresses to the fancy shops uptown would not get lost. Mr. Feldstein stammered about cash flow, about slow-paying retailers. The men listened patiently. Then one of them, his voice still quiet, mentioned he'd heard Mr. Feldstein's daughter was a lovely girl and walked to a very specific public school every day. The room went cold. It wasn't a threat. It was just information, a statement of fact. They left, saying they'd return Friday for his decision. Trembling, Mr. Feldstein turned to his small staff. "Animals," he whispered, but Tommy, sweeping in the corner, saw something else. He saw the flawless, terrifying efficiency of it. No violence had occurred. No property was damaged. Yet Mr. Feldstein was utterly conquered. The pressure applied was precise, psychological, and overwhelming. It was business. Ugly, brutal business, but business nonetheless. Friday came. Mr. Feldstein had an envelope ready, but he was also moving his family to Brooklyn. He was closing the shop. The shadow had won without throwing a single punch. As Tommy collected his final pay, he watched the two men take the envelope. They didn't gloat. They simply nodded, made a note in a small book, and left. One of them, the quieter one, caught Tommy's watching eye. He paused, gave Tommy a long, appraising look, and then, almost imperceptibly, winked. It was a tiny gesture, a spark in the gloom. In that moment, Tommy Gagliano understood. The true power wasn't in the muscle. It was in the mind that directed the muscle. It was in the calculation, the patience, the understanding of exactly what pressure to apply and where. The men were just instruments. He wanted to be the hand that held them. He began to consciously seek out the edges of that shadow world. He started running small errands for a local social club on Elizabeth Street, a place where men with quiet voices and good shoes gathered. He didn't try to be a tough guy. He was reliable. He was silent. He delivered messages without adding or subtracting a word. He remembered names, dates, amounts. He became a useful piece of quiet machinery in a machine that valued discretion above all else. He was learning the most important rule of the life he was choosing. The loudest wolf gets the rifle shot. The wolf that moves unseen, that controls the territory from the deep woods, that is felt but never spotted, that wolf survives. And Tommy Gagliano was a student of survival. The chaotic symphony of the Lower East Side was his classroom, and he was learning to conduct not from the podium, but from the wings, where no one in the audience even knew he was there. The ghost was learning how to walk. Time in the Shadow City moved differently. It wasn't measured in years on a calendar, but in relationships solidified, in trusts earned, in the slow, steady accumulation of influence. Tommy Gagliano became a young man not with a dramatic coming of age, but with a gradual deepening of his presence in the quiet places where things got done. He never chased the spotlight of the street corner. Instead, he became a fixture in the back rooms of nondescript cafes and the cramped offices above storefronts, where the air was stale with cigar smoke and the real business of the neighborhood was transacted. His apprenticeship was served under a man known as Gaetano Reina. Reina was a different kind of power, more traditional, more physically imposing than Tommy would ever be, but sharp and respected. He controlled ice distribution in the Bronx, a vital monopoly in the days before electric refrigeration. Ice kept food from spoiling, medicines cool, and saloons in business. Controlling ice was like controlling a vein of life for the community.
Reina understood leverage.
Tommy, now in his 20s, became one of Reina's many lieutenants, but he stood out for his method. While others enforced collections with grim faces and loud threats, Tommy's approach was conversational. He'd meet a reluctant store owner, not at the door with a scowl, but at a back table with an espresso. He'd talk about the man's family, the challenges of the heat wave, the cost of sawdust to insulate the ice. He'd frame the weekly payment not as extortion, but as a subscription to an essential service, a guarantee of timely delivery, of fair weight, of no unfortunate melting on the delivery route. He made the coercion sound like a business proposition. He made people feel like they were making a choice, even when they had none. This was Tommy's genius, the velvet glove. He learned that most people would willingly pay to avoid chaos, to secure predictability. His job was to make the threat of chaos unspoken but understood, and the path of payment seem like the rational adult choice. He built Reina's ice empire not through terror, but through the cold, clear calculus of consequence. It was during these years that Tommy formed the partnership that would define his life and legacy. He met a young man named Tommy Lucchese. Lucchese was everything Gagliano was not: charismatic, socially agile, with a smile that could disarm and a mind just as sharp as Tommy's. Lucchese had connections. He understood politics, the corrupt machinery of Tammany Hall, the world of favors and introductions. He was a natural frontman, a diplomat. Where Gagliano was the strategist in the back room, Lucchese was the ambassador in the sunlit world. They recognized in each other a perfect complement. Gagliano had the patience and the ruthless strategic mind. Lucchese had the charm and the political web. Together, they were more formidable than either could ever be apart. A deep, unspoken trust formed between them. They were a matched set. Tommy Gagliano's own power base began to coalesce around a new, perfect industry: the garment center. He saw in the frantic, chaotic world of needle trades and fashion houses the same vulnerabilities he'd seen in the ice business, but multiplied 100-fold. It was an industry of fragile deadlines, of delicate fabrics, of expensive machinery, and of immense, fast-moving cash flow. A delayed shipment of thread could shut down a factory. A cut power line could ruin a week's work. A truck hijacked with finished dresses could bankrupt a small house. With Reina's blessing and Lucchese's political grease, Tommy began to offer his services. He didn't storm in with muscle. He sent a polite representative to a factory owner experiencing bad luck. Perhaps the owner's trucks were being stopped for safety inspections every day. Perhaps his cutters were being recruited by a rival. Tommy's man would offer a solution. For a modest fee, he could ensure the trucks had no more inspections. He could guarantee labor peace. He could introduce the owner to a reliable, reasonably priced supplier of silk. It was a virus of control, spreading not through violence, but through the offer of stability. Factory by factory, warehouse by warehouse, Tommy Gagliano's invisible network grew. He became the man who could fix things, the man you saw only when there was a problem, and who left only after creating a permanent, paid-for solution. He owned nothing on paper, but he controlled the flow of everything. He lived modestly, eschewing the flashy cars and suits that other rising stars flaunted. He invested in property, in legitimate fronts, in relationships with bankers and lawyers. He was building an empire of brick and mortar and paper, while his influence was woven into the very fabric of the city's most famous industry. But the Shadow City was not a peaceful kingdom. It was a collection of rival fiefdoms, and a storm was brewing. Two titanic egos were on a collision course. Joe, the boss Masuria, the old-school mustache Pete, greedy and brutal, and Salvatore Maranzano, a Sicilian traditionalist with dreams of being a Caesar. Their war for ultimate control, the Castellamarese War, was looming, a conflict that would drench the streets in blood and rewrite all the rules. Tommy Gagliano, now a powerful captain in the Reina family, watched the clouds gather. He was a man of business, not of war. He saw the coming conflict as a destructive, stupid waste of money and attention. But in a world about to be torn apart by loud, old-world ambitions, the quiet man in the modest suit would have to decide how to survive. His philosophy of whispered power was about to be tested by the thunder of gangland warfare. The Ghost Dawn would have to navigate a hurricane. The storm, when it broke, was not a single clap of thunder, but a rolling series of distant detonations that grew steadily closer. The Castellamarese War wasn't fought on open battlefields. It was conducted in ambushes on rainy streets, in betrayals over dinner tables, in the sudden, startling sound of gunfire where only conversation should have been. For Tommy Gagliano, the master of quiet control, it was an era of unbearable noise. He watched as the old-world titans, Masuria and Maranzano, maneuvered their pawns. It was a war of attrition, draining money, men, and, most importantly to Tommy, attention. The police, who could often be persuaded to look the other way for a discreet business arrangement, were now under immense pressure to crack down. Newspapers splashed gangland murders across their front pages, turning hoodlums into household names and drawing the heat of City Hall and the federal government. This was the antithesis of everything Tommy believed in. His own position was precarious. He was a loyal and prosperous captain in the Reina family, but Gaetano Reina was a significant player, and in a war, significant players become targets. Tommy's garment district operations, his beautiful, silent machine of controlled chaos, began to sputter. Trucking routes were disrupted by police checkpoints set up to catch warring gunmen. Factory owners, already paying Tommy for protection, now feared being caught in the crossfire of a war they didn't understand. The predictable economy of fear he'd built was being shaken by a typhoon of real, unpredictable violence. Then came the earthquake. Gaetano Reina was murdered, shot down on a Bronx street in 1930. The order, it was whispered, came from Joe Masuria himself, who saw Reina as leaning toward Maranzano's faction. For Tommy, it was a personal loss and a profound professional crisis. The family was decapitated. The ice business, the crews, the territory, it was all up for grabs, a prize to be fought over by the warring giants. The structure he relied on was crumbling. In the chaotic aftermath, Tommy did what he did best. He observed and calculated. He saw the ambition in the eyes of other Reina captains. He saw the greedy reach of Masuria and the rigid traditionalism of Maranzano. And he saw a third path emerging, personified by a younger, colder, more visionary man, Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Luciano was a different animal. He wasn't fighting for the title of boss of bosses, an old Sicilian concept he considered foolish. He was a corporatist. He saw the violence as bad for business. He spoke of a commission, a board of directors for the underworld, where disputes could be settled with votes instead of volleys. This philosophy resonated deeply with Tommy Gagliano's soul. It was order. It was structure. It was business. Tommy began to quietly align himself with Luciano's emerging faction. He brought with him his most valuable asset, Tommy Lucchese. Lucchese, with his political ear to the ground, confirmed that the old ways were dying. Tammany Hall was tired of the headlines. The future belonged to those who could make the machine run quietly and profitably. The climax of the war was not a grand battle, but two surgical strikes that changed everything. First, on Luciano's orders, Masuria was gunned down in a Coney Island restaurant in 1931. Then, mere months later, Maranzano was eliminated in his own office. The two dinosaurs were gone, slaughtered by the very modern thinking they despised. In the sudden, eerie silence that followed the gun smoke, Lucky Luciano stood to reorganize the American mafia. The five-family structure was created. It was a corporate merger of epic proportions, dissolving old loyalties and creating new, streamlined entities. And in this new corporate chart, Tommy Gagliano's name was written at the top. Luciano, recognizing Tommy's quiet effectiveness, his profitable garment district empire, and his strategic alliance with Lucchese, awarded him leadership of one of the five families, what had been the Reina family. It was a staggering promotion, from captain to boss overnight, not by conquest, but by appointment, because he represented stability, profitability, and silence. His underboss, his partner, was Tommy Lucchese. The two Tommies stood together in a quiet room after the news was delivered. There were no celebrations. The weight was immense. "This is what we wanted," Lucchese said, his usual smile absent, replaced by a look of sober assessment. A seat at the table. Gagliano looked out the window, down at the streets now free of the war's immediate fear. "It's not a table, Tommy. It's a desk. And now we have to run the business. Our business is quiet. This family," he said, turning to his friend, "will be the quietest of them all.
No headlines. No flash.
We are in the garment business, the trucking business, the real estate business. We are businessmen." He laid down the law for his new family immediately. Flashy behavior was discouraged. Talking to reporters was forbidden. Unnecessary violence was a failure of intellect. Their strength would be in their invisibility, in their deep integration into the legitimate economy, and in the unshakable, hidden pressure they could apply. The Castellamarese War had ended with the loud, bloody death of the old order. And from the ashes, Tommy Gagliano emerged not as a warlord, but as a CEO. His territory wasn't defined by street corners, but by sewing machine needles and trucking manifests. The Ghost Dawn had not just survived the hurricane. He had used its winds to disappear even more completely into the shadows, now with an empire to manage. The war for noise was over. The era of quiet power had officially begun. The dust of the war settled over New York, leaving a new skyline of power. For Tommy Gagliano, the silence was not an absence of sound, but the hum of a well-tuned engine. He had his family. He had his seat. Now came the real work, building an empire that was not just powerful but permanent. He and Lucchese operated from a simple, two-pronged philosophy. Lucchese would be the face in the light, greasing the wheels of politics and high society. Gagliano would be the hand in the shadows, tightening the gears of industry and finance. They were one entity with two expressions. Their primary target was already under their influence, but now they aimed for total dominion. The garment district. To the outside world, it was a glamorous, chaotic universe of designers, models, and moguls. To Gagliano, it was a perfectly engineered machine for generating wealth, and every single moving part was a potential point of control. He didn't send gangsters with baseball bats. He sent businessmen with contracts. His approach was a masterclass in vertical integration. 1. The trucking monopoly *. This was the linchpin. He consolidated control over the trucking companies that moved every piece of fabric, every rack of dresses, every spool of thread in the district. A factory couldn't get its raw materials without a Gagliano-approved truck. A designer couldn't ship his finished line to stores without a Gagliano-licensed carrier. The rates were negotiated. The service was exclusive. Refusal meant your goods sat forever on a loading dock, or your delicate silks were accidentally damaged by rain. The pressure was economic, logistical, and inescapable. 2. The union leverage * through Lucchese's political connections and strategic persuasion. They infiltrated key unions, most notably the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, ILGWU. Control the union and you control the workforce. You could guarantee labor peace for a friendly manufacturer, or you could call a devastating strike on a competitor. The threat of a strike could bankrupt a company faster than any torch. It was clean, legal-looking, and brutally effective. 3. The supplier squeeze * Gagliano's men would approach fabric mills, button suppliers, thread makers. They offered to be their exclusive sales agent in the garment district. Refusal meant the district's biggest manufacturers, who were already under Gagliano's thumb, would suddenly find your product unsatisfactory. Acceptance meant paying a quiet tariff on every yard of cloth sold. It was a closed ecosystem. A dress manufacturer had to buy fabric from a Gagliano-influenced mill, have it delivered by a Gagliano truck, have it sewn by workers from a Gagliano-influenced union, and ship the final product on another Gagliano truck. At every step, a tiny, invisible tax was levied. It wasn't robbery. It was a toll. The ghost tax. Tommy himself became a specter in the district. He owned a small, unassuming coat manufacturing company as a legitimate front. He would sometimes be seen there, a neatly dressed man in his late 40s, discussing lining materials or shipping schedules with his foreman. He looked like any other small business owner fighting to survive the Depression. No one looking at him would see the puppet master whose strings reached into the grandest fashion houses on 7th Avenue. This era highlighted the stark contrast between Gagliano and the other new kings of New York. While Albert Anastasia of the Gambino family ruled the docks with terrifying, public brutality, and Vito Genovese schemed with volatile ambition, Gagliano hosted quiet meetings in his office above a bakery. His reports weren't about bodies dropped in rivers, but about profit margins, union dues collected, and real estate parcels acquired. His violence was the violence of the stalled truck, the denied loan, the rejected permit. It was bureaucratic and therefore far more durable. His partnership with Lucchese deepened into a legendary symbiosis. Lucchese would secure a city contract for garbage collection or construction. Gagliano's trucking companies would get the subcontract. Lucchese would learn of a new zoning law. Gagliano would buy the affected land quietly, through shell companies, before the news became public. Lucchese charmed and networked at Tammany Hall events and upstate racetracks. Gagliano managed the books, enforced the agreements, and reinvested the profits into more legitimate fronts. Laundries, restaurants, pieces of property. They communicated in a shorthand built on absolute trust. A nod from Gagliano meant a deal was approved. A smile from Lucchese meant the political coast was clear. They were the twin engines of a single, silent aircraft, soaring high above the turbulent, violent streets where other families still sometimes stumbled. By the late 1930s, the Gagliano, though the public would never know the name, family was arguably the wealthiest and most stable of the five. It had weathered the Depression not through bank robberies, but by embedding itself in the essential commerce of the city. Its wealth was laundered through the very sweat and industry of New York's most famous district. Tommy Gagliano, the immigrant boy from the Lower East Side, now lived in a comfortable but not ostentatious house in the Bronx. He read the papers not for news of himself, there never was any, but to track economic trends, political shifts, and union activities. He had achieved a form of power so complete it was indistinguishable from the background noise of the city itself. He was the steady pressure in the air before a storm that never quite breaks. He was the man who proved that the most powerful ghost is not the one that haunts a house, but the one that owns the mortgage on every house on the block. The empire of whispers was now a fortress. The fortress of silence, however, existed in a city of noise. And the greatest threat to Tommy Gagliano's empire of whispers was not the police or rival gangs, but the changing tide of history itself. The 1930s bled into the 1940s, and the world was engulfed in a war that reached even into the Shadow City. For Tommy, World War II presented not a moral challenge, but an operational one. The garment district pivoted to parachutes and uniforms. Government contracts flowed, but with them came scrutiny, audits, and the relentless gaze of the federal machine. You couldn't fix a Pentagon inspector with a quiet envelope and a nod. This was a problem for the loud bosses, the ones whose wealth was piled in cash in safe deposit boxes. For Gagliano, it was an opportunity. His money was already woven into the legitimate economy. His trucking firms won legitimate government contracts to move military supplies. His coat factory secured a modest order for army overcoats. He used the war as a giant laundering machine, blending his illicit ghost tax revenue with patriotic profits. While other mobsters struggled to hide their money, Gagliano's grew cleaner, more invested, more real. But the war also removed a crucial stabilizing force. In 1946, Lucky Luciano was deported to Italy. Luciano, the architect of the commission, the corporate visionary, was gone. The board of directors was now missing its chairman. Into that power vacuum slithered a new kind of snake, Vito Genovese. Genovese was ambition incarnate. He had fled to Italy to avoid murder charges, only to return after the war, believing his time had come. He saw the mafia not as a corporate partnership, but as a kingdom he was destined to rule. He viewed the other bosses, especially the quiet ones like Gagliano, not as partners but as vassals in waiting. He was loud, arrogant, and believed power was taken, not earned through patient calculation. The first tremors of this new threat reached Gagliano not through a violent act, but through a breach of protocol. Genovese began courting soldiers and captains from other families, offering promises of greater spoils under his future reign. He bypassed the bosses, the commission, the whole structure Luciano had built. He was a hostile corporate raider, trying to stage a takeover by poaching mid-level management. One of these captains was in Gagliano's own family. A man named Joe Rosselli, who ran some of the garment district trucking operations, started being seen at social clubs frequented by Genovese's people. He bought a new Cadillac. He talked a little too loosely about big changes on the horizon. Tommy Lucchese brought the news to Gagliano, his face uncharacteristically grim. Genovese is making moves. He's talking to Rosselli. He's talking to others. He doesn't respect the commission. He thinks it's a debating society for old men. Gagliano listened, sitting behind his plain desk in his plain office. He didn't rage. He steepled his fingers, a gesture that had become his trademark when thinking. Rosselli has been with us since the Reina days, he said, his voice soft. He's made a lot of money being with us. Ambition is a hungry stomach, Tommy. It forgets who filled it. What does he want? Gagliano asked, not of Lucchese, but as a question to the air. To be more than a captain, to be a power. Genovese is selling dreams of empires. We sell a steady paycheck. For some men, the dream is more attractive. Gagliano nodded. This was the challenge of quiet power. It was sustainable, profitable, and safe. But it wasn't glamorous. Couldn't compete with the fever dream of absolute dominance that a man like Genovese peddled. He was facing a conflict of philosophies. He could have had Rosselli killed. It would have been the standard, loud solution, a message written in blood. But Gagliano hated messages. They attracted attention. They created martyrs. They prompted investigations. And, most importantly, they would mean engaging in Genovese's kind of war, a war of personality and bluster. Instead, Gagliano chose a move of pure, cold, strategic pressure. He called Rosselli to his office. He didn't mention Genovese. He didn't accuse. He sat the nervous captain down and slid a set of ledgers across the desk. "Joe," Gagliano said, his tone that of a disappointed but fair CEO. "I've been reviewing the trucking books for the Eastern District." "Your district? The numbers for the last 18 months. They don't match the volume of shipments the manufacturers are reporting." He let the silence hang. Rosselli's face paled. The ledgers were, of course, accurate. Every captain skimmed. It was an understood, silent tax they levied for themselves. But it was never, ever acknowledged. "I'm not a greedy man, Joe," Gagliano continued, his eyes like dark pools. "A man should enjoy the fruits of his labor. But this," he tapped the ledger, "this looks less like fruit and more like you took the whole tree. It looks like stealing from your partners. From me. From Tommy." He gestured to Lucchese, who stood by the window, a silent witness. Rosselli started to stammer a defense. Gagliano held up a hand. "I'm not interested in excuses. I'm interested in stability, in loyalty, the family's health." He closed the ledger. "Here is what will happen. You will reconcile these books. You will return what you took from the family's share. Not from your pocket, from your excess. And you will decline any future investment opportunities from outside parties. Your capital is tied up here in your work. Do you understand the situation?" It was a masterstroke. No threat against Rosselli's life. A threat against his wallet and his position. Gagliano had exposed his disloyalty not as treachery, but as embezzlement. A business crime. The punishment was financial and professional humiliation. If Rosselli went to Genovese now, he'd be going as a branded thief, not a prized asset. And Genovese, for all his talk, had no use for a captain who couldn't control his own books. Rosselli left the office, broken not in body, but in spirit. The message was sent not to the streets, but to the balance sheets. Gagliano had defended his fortress not with cannons, but with accountants. He had shown that in his kingdom, the most dangerous weapon was not a gun, but a ledger that knew the truth. After Rosselli left, Lucchese finally smiled. "He'll crawl back to Genovese and tell him you're a banker, not a boss. Genovese won't know what to do with that." Gagliano looked out at the city, the great, groaning engine he had learned to siphon power from. "Let him think what he wants, Tommy. While he's dreaming of crowns, we're collecting the rent. And in the end, the landlord always wins." The ghost Don had faced his first major internal threat and had dissolved it in the acid of cold, hard numbers. The silence, once again, was his most potent shield. The specter that finally threatened Tommy Gagliano's empire was not a rival with a gun, but a senator with a gavel. The post-war world had a new appetite for order, a hunger for cleanliness, and in 1950, that hunger found its voice in Senator Estes Kefauver. His Senate Special Committee to investigate organized crime was not like the local police. Couldn't be bribed, couldn't be intimidated. It was a machine designed for one purpose, to generate light. And light was the one thing the ghost Don could not survive. The Kefauver Committee came to New York with television cameras in tow. A new, terrifying technology that brought the scrutiny of the hearing room into every living room in America. They called the big names. Frank Costello, the prime minister of the underworld, whose nervous hands became a national fascination. Joe Adonis, smooth and unflappable. Albert Anastasia, glowering under the lights. They were asked about gambling, about murder, about their sources of income. The country watched, mesmerized by the theater of it. Through it all, the committee staff, a small army of lawyers and investigators, kept hearing a name in the background. A whisper. When they traced the money flowing through the garment district, when they followed the threads of union corruption and trucking monopolies, the path kept leading to a shadowy, seldom photographed figure, Tommy Gagliano. The other bosses prepared for the worst. They hired flashy lawyers. They held press conferences denying everything. They went into hiding. The air was thick with panic and bravado. Tommy Gagliano prepared by doing nothing. He sat with Lucchese in their now familiar office. The atmosphere was tense, but Gagliano's calm was an anchor. "They have cameras, Tommy," Lucchese said, uncharacteristically pacing. "They have microphones. They're making clowns out of everyone. Costello's hands are all over the newsreels. They're turning us into entertainment." Gagliano nodded. "That is their weapon. The spotlight. They want us to perform, to sweat, to lie on camera, to become characters in their show." He shook his head slowly. "We will not be characters, but they have our names. They have paper trails. The trucking companies, the union locals. Do they have me?" Gagliano asked, his voice a low hum. "What do they have? A few old photographs? Hearsay from competitors? I am a businessman. I own a coat company. I have a union card from the ILGWU, Local 89. I pay my taxes." He had spent 2 decades building this exact defense. A legitimate identity so boring, so papered over, that it was bulletproof. The committee's subpoena arrived. It was a heavy, formal document and summons to appear before the United States Senate. For most men in his world, it was a death warrant. Gagliano looked at it, then handed it to his lawyer, a quiet, expensive man from a Wall Street firm who specialized in corporate tax law, not criminal defense. "We will respond respectfully. We will provide the documents they ask for, the ones for my legitimate businesses. Nothing more. And if they insist you testify?" Lucchese asked. Gagliano allowed himself a small, thin smile. It was a rare sight. "I am a sick man, Tommy. My heart. The doctors have letters. The strain of such a spectacle. It could be fatal. A man has a right to protect his health." It was his final, perfect defense. Not defiance, but frailty. He would not be a bold gangster defying Congress. He would be a frail, elderly businessman, too ill to endure the cruelty of the cameras. He would hide in the open, shielded by a doctor's note. The day of the scheduled hearing arrived. The courtroom was packed, the cameras poised. They called for Thomas Gagliano. His lawyer stood, impeccable in a 3-piece suit. He presented notarized medical affidavits from 2 distinguished cardiologists. He spoke in a dry, legal monotone about congestive heart failure, about the profound risk of stress, about his client's deep regret that his health prevented him from assisting the committee's important work. There was frustration, but no drama. You couldn't televise a doctor's note. The senators blustered, but they couldn't drag a supposedly dying man from his sickbed. It was a tactical masterstroke of passive resistance. Meanwhile, the television circus proceeded. The public saw Costello's hands, heard Anastasia's defiant grunts, watched the glamorous gangsters of legend be reduced to stammering, Fifth Amendment-taking caricatures. Their mystique was stripped away under the Klieg lights, and the man they called the Ghost Don simply vanished. Not into hiding, but into the mundane. He was at his coat factory that week, discussing wool prices for the fall line. He was a sick old man going about his business, too unimportant, too boring for television. The Kefauver Committee eventually left New York. It produced sensational headlines, a mountain of testimony, and a few new laws. It crippled the public reputations of the flashy bosses. But in its voluminous final report, the entry on Thomas Gagliano was brief, frustratingly vague, and yielded no prosecutions. He was a footnote, a shadow they could not illuminate. In the aftermath, the landscape had changed. The old, loud way was now a liability. Public infamy was a death sentence. The other families were weakened, paranoid, their operations disrupted. Tommy Gagliano met with Lucchese after the storm had passed. "They made a mistake," Gagliano said, looking over the quiet streets from his office window. "They thought our power was in our reputation, in being feared on the street. They burned that reputation down for everyone to see, but our power was never there." He turned to his partner. "Our power is in the truck that delivers the dress, in the union contract that guarantees the work, in the deed to the building. They can't subpoena a truck. They can't put a building on television." Lucchese nodded, a look of profound respect in his eyes. "They went hunting for monsters under the bed. They never thought to check the mortgage on the house." The Kefauver hearings had been meant to expose and destroy organized crime. Instead, for the Gagliano family, they had performed a brutal natural selection. The loud, the flashy, the famous had been cut down. The quiet, the embedded, the ghostly had been left standing. Tommy Gagliano hadn't just survived the most intense scrutiny the country could muster. He had proven, once and for all, that his philosophy was not just a strategy, but the key to survival in the modern world. The age of the celebrity gangster was over. The age of the silent, corporate entity had begun. And its first and greatest architect was a sick old man in a coat factory, whose heart, against all odds, kept beating steadily in the dark. The victory over the Kefauver Committee was absolute, but it was a victory that left a peculiar aftertaste, like drinking water from a pristine, deep well and tasting the distant, cold presence of stone. Tommy Gagliano had outmaneuvered the United States Senate not by fighting, but by fading. He had proven that his philosophy was the ultimate defense. Yet, in the quiet of his office afterward, with the headlines about other men crinkling in the wastebasket, he felt not triumph, but the heavy weight of a finished equation. He was getting old. The doctor's notes he'd used as a shield weren't entirely fiction. The tightness in his chest was real, a constant, dull companion. The world he had mastered was changing. Air travel was shrinking distances. Television was creating a national culture. The old neighborhood loyalties were dissolving in the suburban sprawl. And the commission, Luciano's great innovation, was becoming a tense boardroom where the new generation, men like Genovese and the rising Carlo Gambino, eyed each other with a hunger that reminded him of the bad old days before the war. He watched this from a greater distance than ever. He became more spectral, even to his own family. He let Tommy Lucchese handle more and more of the daily operations, the meetings, the negotiations. Lucchese was now the undisputed acting boss in all but name. He was brilliant at it, smoothing over disputes, forging new alliances, exploring new ventures in vending machines and the nascent world of commercial air travel. He was the perfect successor, a man who understood the power of politics and smiles, but who had been schooled for 2 decades in the Gagliano doctrine of silence and substance. One crisp autumn afternoon in 1951, Gagliano asked Lucchese to drive with him. They didn't take a driver. Gagliano himself guided his unremarkable sedan out of the city, north along the Hudson River. They didn't speak for a long time, the only sound the hum of the engine and the whisper of tires on pavement. They passed the grand estates of Westchester, places built by the robber barons of a previous century. Men whose names were on libraries and universities, not police blotters. "See those houses, Tommy?" Gagliano finally said, his eyes on the road. "Those men, they were pirates. They stole whole railroads. They broke unions. They bought senators like they were buying apples. And now, legends, philanthropists, their grandchildren go to the best schools." Lucchese nodded, understanding the point. "They won the last chapter. They wrote the history. That's the only victory that matters," Gagliano said softly. "Not the money you pile up in a vault. The story that's told after you're gone. The name that's left behind." He pulled the car over at a scenic overlook. The mighty Hudson stretched below, slate-gray ribbon of relentless purpose. The Palisades rose on the far side, immutable and silent. "They wanted to put my name in the papers, Tommy," Kefauver and the rest. They wanted a story about a gangster, a monster. He turned off the engine. The silence was immense. I gave them a story about a sick old coat manufacturer. A nothing. A blank space. That was my victory. I kept the story empty. He looked at Lucchese, his gaze clearer and more direct than it had been in years. My chapter is ending. The tightness in my chest. It's not an act anymore. The doctors give me months. A year, maybe. Lucchese didn't offer false comfort or protest. He simply absorbed the news, his face a mask of solemn acceptance. The partnership had always been rooted in truth. This family, Gagliano continued, gesturing back toward the city, it's not a gang, it's a corporation. We have a pension plan, for God's sake. We have real estate holdings. We have a system. It has to continue. Not with a war, not with a fanfare. With a signature on a piece of paper. With a quiet understanding. He was naming his successor, not with a ceremony, but with a conversation overlooking a river. You have the mind for it, Gagliano said. You have the connections. But you must remember the core principle. We are not in the business of fear. We are in the business of certainty. We sell peace. The peace to run your factory, to drive your truck, to have your union job without unexpected problems. That product is more valuable than any drug, any gambling slip. It's invisible and it's essential. Protect that. Protect the silence. Lucchese placed a hand on the older man's shoulder. The business will continue. The silence will remain. I give you my word. It was all that needed to be said. The transfer of power for one of America's most powerful criminal enterprises was sealed not with an oath of blood, but with a promise between two businessmen on a roadside. The drive back to the city was quiet. Gagliano felt a profound fatigue, but also a deep release. He had built something that would outlast him. He had navigated the gang wars, the Great Depression, a world war, and a Senate investigation, and he was leaving on his own terms, his legacy intact, his name still clean in the only way that mattered to him, unsullied by public infamy. In the following weeks, he withdrew completely. He spent time in his garden. He visited his coat factory one last time, not to work, but to smell the wool and the machine oil, the sense of his legitimate life. He made sure his will was in order, his assets cleanly divided, his family provided for through legitimate trusts. Tommy Gagliano died in his sleep at his home in the Bronx in February 1953. The cause was heart failure. The newspaper obituaries were brief and respectful. They mentioned he was a garment industry businessman and a community figure. There was no mention of the commission of the garment district monopoly of the Ghost Dawn. The story, as he had fought so hard to ensure, remained blank. His funeral was a modest, dignified affair. Many faces from the Shadow City were there, but they came as businessmen, mourners in dark overcoats, not as gangsters. Tommy Lucchese stood by the grave, his head bowed. He was now the boss. The family, in time, would come to bear his name. But the architecture of the empire, its foundation of silent, pervasive economic control, would forever be the work of Tommy Gagliano. On the wind-swept hill of the cemetery, as the final prayers were spoken, Lucchese kept his promise. He made no speech. He drew no attention. He simply honored the silence his friend and partner had cherished. The greatest trick the Ghost Dawn ever pulled was convincing the world he was never there. And in the end, he left a kingdom so quiet, so seamlessly woven into the fabric of the city, that it could thrive forever in the absence of its king. The silence after Tommy Gagliano's passing was not the silence of absence, but the deep, resonant quiet of a foundation settling. The empire did not shudder or fracture. The machine, so meticulously built, continued its humming, profit-making operations. Garment trucks rolled. Union dues were collected. Real estate deals closed. The Shadow Corporation executed its business, its boardroom now chaired by Tommy Lucchese. Lucchese honored his friend's final wish with the precision of a master accountant. He did not change the company's name immediately. For a time, in the internal ledgers of the underworld, it was still referred to as the Gagliano family. This was Lucchese's ultimate tribute, a recognition that the structure itself was Gagliano's masterpiece. He was merely its new chief executive. Lucchese's brilliance was in expansion, not alteration. He took Gagliano's model of quiet, industrial control and applied it to new sectors. He deepened the family's reach into the airport rackets at the newly bustling Idlewild, later JFK. He moved into vending machines, jukeboxes, and the waste disposal industry, all fields where a monopoly could be built through peaceful persuasion and logistical strangleholds, not bloody turf wars. He was applying the ghost tax to the booming, modernizing American economy. For over a decade, the legacy of the Ghost Don seemed not just secure, but invincible. The family under Lucchese grew richer and more powerful than ever, all while maintaining that crucial veil of quiet respectability. Lucchese became a celebrated philanthropist in certain circles, donating to hospitals and Catholic charities. He was the acceptable, connected face of organized crime, a man who could sit with politicians and bishops. It was the full realization of Gagliano's dream, power without infamy. But time is the one force even a ghost cannot control. The world kept turning. The children of the immigrants who had populated the old neighborhoods went to college, moved to the suburbs, and entered a different America. The garment district itself began to shrink, its work outsourced overseas. The social glue of tight-knit, rule-bound communities that had formed the ecosystem for the five families began to dissolve. And a new, far more dangerous enemy emerged, the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover. For decades, Hoover had famously denied the existence of a national organized crime syndicate, focusing instead on bank robbers and communists. But pressure mounted, and by the 1960s, the FBI finally turned its immense, technologically advanced, and patient machinery on La Cosa Nostra. They didn't rely on headlines or television cameras. They used wiretaps. They used forensic accounting. They used confidential informants. They fought ghosts with science and bureaucracy. The first major crack in the Lucchese family's armor came not from a street soldier, but from a microphone hidden in a lamp. The FBI listened as the new generation of captains, men who hadn't been forged in Gagliano's school of silence, talked. They talked about hits, about kicks, about scores. They used the old language, and it was recorded in cold, metallic detail on magnetic tape. Then came the laws, the RICO Act, Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. This was a weapon Gagliano could never have anticipated. It didn't just target a murder or an extortion. It allowed prosecutors to go after the entire enterprise. The very corporation he had built could now be indicted as a whole. The legacy of quiet, legitimate-looking business became a liability. It was the paper trail that proved the criminal conspiracy. One by one, the heirs to the quiet empire fell. Lucchese himself, for all his political armor, died of cancer in 1967, escaping the coming storm but leaving a family that had grown accustomed to its invulnerability. Subsequent bosses and underbosses were caught on tape, convicted under RICO, and sent away for lifetimes. The philosophy of silence had been predicated on a world where the authorities were corruptible, local, and uninterested in complex financial paper trails. It could not withstand the federal, institutional, technological assault of the late 20th century. The FBI didn't need a Tommy Gagliano to sweat under Klieg lights. They could reconstruct his entire empire from phone records and bank statements. By the 1990s, the Lucchese family was a shell, riddled with informants like Alphonse Darco, an acting boss who flipped and revealed its innermost secrets. The garment district rackets were a memory. The union control had been broken by federal monitors. The once fearsome, silent corporation was now a case study in the U.S. Attorney's Office. So what remained of Tommy Gagliano? He remained a paradox, a footnote in the official history of organized crime, yet a legendary template among those who study power. He proved that ultimate control could be achieved through anonymity and economic pressure. He built a legacy so successful it bore another man's name for eternity. In the end, his story is not one of morality but of methodology. In the brutal calculus of the Shadow City, he was the supreme mathematician. His ghost doesn't haunt old social clubs or grave sites. It lingers in the understanding that the most formidable power structures are often the ones you cannot see, cannot name, and only feel in the subtle, inescapable pressure of your daily life. The price of peace, the cost of doing business, the silent partner in every transaction. Tommy Gagliano mastered that realm completely, and though his specific empire is gone, the chilling lesson of his life endures. Sometimes the most powerful man in the room is the one you never knew was there at all. Thank you for joining history for hours for this journey into the shadows. If you found the tale of the ghost dawn compelling, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. But the story of a ghost is never truly over. It lingers in the echoes of its influence, in the empty spaces it once occupied, and in the unsettling feeling that what has vanished may have simply taken another form. The physical empire of Tommy Gagliano, the trucking companies, the union locals, the quiet offices, was dismantled by time, technology, and the relentless force of federal law. Yet, the blueprint he drafted, the philosophy of silent, pervasive, and economic control, did not crumble into dust. It drifted on the wind, settling into new foundations in a changing world. In the aftermath of the FBI's victories and the RICO convictions, the street-level power of the traditional families waned. But nature abhors a vacuum, and power abhors visibility. As the old mobsters faded into prison or obscurity, a new generation of operators studied their history not as a manual, but as a cautionary tale. They saw the downfall of the loud and the eventual vulnerability of even the quiet. The lesson they took from Gagliano was not the how, but the why. Why silence was the ultimate asset. This new breed didn't dream of social clubs or garment district monopolies. They operated in the nebulous world of cybercrime, sophisticated fraud, and global finance. They understood that Gagliano's genius was in controlling the infrastructure, the trucks, the unions, the essential pathways of commerce. Their infrastructure became the internet, the banking system, and the complex web of international shell companies. They built empires that were even more ghostly than Gagliano's. There were no men in leather jackets making polite offers. There were lines of code silently diverting funds, or phishing emails harvesting data from thousands of miles away. The protection they offered wasn't against broken kneecaps, but against data leaks and distributed denial-of-service attacks. The ghost tax was now a cryptocurrency transaction, untraceable and instant. And in the legitimate world, the most successful corporations began to operate on a
Strangely familiar principle.
The goal was no longer just to compete, but to control the ecosystem, to own the app store, the cloud server, the payment processor, the data stream. They sought to be the indispensable, often invisible layer upon which other businesses relied. They sold certainty just as Gagliano did. Certainty of delivery, of connectivity, of market access. The pressure applied was not physical, but existential. Fail to comply with the platform's rules, and you simply cease to exist in the digital marketplace. Tommy Gagliano's face never appeared on a wanted poster or a television screen. Today, his digital successors don't have faces at all. They have handles, avatar, and encrypted identities. Their power is measured in bandwidth and binary, not in street corners. They are the ultimate realization of the ghostly ideal: power without a body, influence without a name. Meanwhile, the name Lucchese endures in history books and true crime documentaries, a symbol of a bygone era of organized crime. But the quieter name, Gagliano, is whispered in different circles. Among historians of urban economics, students of organizational theory, and those who study the architecture of power. He is analyzed not as a gangster, but as a strategist of remarkable foresight. His personal legacy is a series of quiet absences. The coat factory is long gone, replaced by a glass-fronted boutique selling minimalist apparel. The old social clubs are trendy espresso bars. The streets of the garment district are now patrolled by fashion students and tourists, not by union enforcers. The physical world he manipulated has been scrubbed clean, gentrified, rebranded. Yet walk through those streets today. Feel the rhythm of the city, the relentless pace, the underlying tension of commerce, the understanding that everything has a price and every transaction has an unseen cost. In that feeling, the ghost of Tommy Gagliano still walks. not as a man but as a principle, a chilling reminder that the most profound power often resides not in the threat of violence, but in the control of the means, not in the fear of the knock on the door, but in the surrender to the terms of service, not in the shadow of a gun, but in the fine print of a contract you never knew you signed. His story ends not with a period, but with an ellipsis, a trailing thought that connects a quiet man in a 1940s office to the invisible architectures of power that shape our world today. The ghost Don achieved the only immortality he ever sought. He became an idea. And ideas, especially the dangerous, elegant, and silent ones, are the hardest things of all to kill. Thank you for spending these hours with History for Hours, exploring the legacy of a man who built an empire of silence. If these journeys into the echoes of history resonate with you, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Which other whispered architects of our world should we explore next? Until then, remember, the most powerful stories are often the ones told in the quietest voices. Good night.